Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. My name is Andrew Tillett. I'm the Defence and the Foreign Affairs correspondent for the Australian Financial Review and Vice President here at the club. Our guest today is Robert Nioa, the CEO of Nioa Group, one of Australia's leading homegrown defence companies. Starting out as a gun retailer in Queensland in the 1970s, the company has become a leading manufacturer of munitions and firearms here in Australia and in the US. We had Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy here at the club earlier this week, insisting everything was fine in defence industry. But as we will see, the defence industry is becoming increasingly frustrated by the Albanese government, and Robert is better placed than most to perhaps give it to the government with both barrels. Anyway, thank you. Try the veal. Anyway, you can follow the conversation at Press Club Aust or #MPC, and please everyone welcome Robert Nioa to the stage.
Thank you, Andrew, for that kind introduction. I think we'll be probably kinder on the government than maybe you hope. But also thank you, everyone, for being here. The Nioa business did start small, selling sporting firearms in the corner of a service station in regional Queensland 50 years ago today, or 50 years ago this year. It has now grown to be the largest Australian-owned supplier of munitions to the Australian and New Zealand Defence Forces. In Australia, we operate half of the Australian Government's Benalla munitions facility in Victoria, where with partners like Rheinmetall and Northrop Grumman, we have privately invested in establishing medium calibre cannon ammunition and 120mm tank ammunition production lines. We're the prime contractor for a range of defence programs, including the Army's future family of artillery ammunition, the major munitions contract, which covers supply and the option for domestic production of over 70 natures of ammunition from 20 different international factories around the world. We're also the prime contractor for the Tranche 1 of the Army's lethality program, which is a program aimed at modernising the weapons for the men and women of the ADF. Also, we're the prime contractor for the Army's lightweight automatic grenade launcher program. We have recently built a greenfield, state-of-the-art artillery shell forging factory in my hometown of Maryborough, Queensland, with our joint venture partner, Rheinmetall. A few weeks ago, we announced an agreement with L3 Aerojet Rocketdyne to explore the establishment of a multi-user rocket motor production facility in Australia to support domestic and allied missile production. We established and own the Australian Missile Corporation, which is principally a collaboration platform for now more than 350 Australian and international companies. Earlier this year, we acquired the US-based Barrett Firearms, which supplies all of the sniper rifles to the US military and exports to 70 State Department-approved countries around the world. And this month, we became the first Australian company to ever be granted tenancy at the US government's Picatinny Arsenal, where the US munitions industrial base and research and development programs are run for all conventional weapons and munitions. So with that background, you can imagine that I've been relishing the prospect of speaking at the National Press Club here today on this topic. The state and shape of Australia's defence industrial base is something which impacts on our shared futures as Australians. Today, I'm calling for urgent action to strengthen Australia's national security. For years, I've been observing what Australian policy documents rather dryly call a deterioration in our regional security. Europe is enduring the largest and most destructive war in generations. The Middle East is in turmoil. In the Indo-Pacific region, a large authoritarian power, China, is challenging the status quo, seeking regional domination. This is the world we face. It's not surprising that people make analogies with the late 1930s. Industry leaders could sit back and wait for the government and defence to develop a new set of industry policy settings to respond to these challenges. But rather than leaving all of the heavy lifting in this policy area to the department and government, we thought it would be better to provide some constructive inputs to the public debate. That will include us contributing to the policy making and decision making in this important space. So that's why I got together with a group of like-minded Australian companies to produce the report we are releasing here today. My speech summarises the detailed work and recommendations that it contains. We are Gilmore Space, Austal, Macquarie Telecom Group, the Nioa Group and the Australian Industry Defence Network. We represent the best locally developed defence capabilities and technology in Australia. We span defence, national security, space, national and regional resilience, and we are here to make the case that the government needs to do more to create the foundations for an industry resurgence in Australia. The report sets out a pathway to building genuine sovereign capability in defence industry. This pathway would enable Australian medium and small companies, each with innovative, potentially world-leading capabilities, marshalled together by an Australian prime to generate robust, resilient capability for defence. We're not looking for handouts, and we're comfortable that Australian companies succeed or fail on our own energies and our own capabilities. None of us, frankly, have been beneficiaries of past industry policy largesse, nor do we look for it. But as Australian companies deeply concerned about the national security outlook, we do look to government to make it possible for Australian companies to succeed. The government has the power to deliver this outcome. Government sets the rules and makes the decisions. It needs to create the signals to which industry can respond. As Winston Churchill urged the Americans in 1941, give us the tools and we will finish the job. In our case, the tools are the conditions that will allow strong Australian-owned and run defence prime companies to emerge. The timing is urgent because of our difficult national outlook, and the risk of conflict is real. Even our most trusted security partners will be stretched in the event of a regional war. So Australia must have more independent capacity to defend ourselves and to be a strong partner with our allies in collective defence. To be clear, independent capability and industrial collaboration with our allies are not competing objectives. They can certainly be one and the same. Dr. Bill LaPlante, the US Department of Defence's Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, has been clear about the need for allies to boost production to alleviate the drain on the struggling US supply chains. He is calling on allies to build factories, establish industry partnerships, set up co-production, co-development, co-sustainment initiatives, and support the notion of forward-deployed logistics in contested regions. This is the American defence industry policy response to a deterioration in global security. Because of the closeness of our alliance, it will rightly drive industry policy change here too. But while we step up to that challenge, we must also focus on our own defence needs, being sovereign, being more self-reliant, able to draw on our own defence capabilities, and we must be more like Ukraine, able to generate and employ military force for our defence with support from other partners. We need a national defence industry policy. Industry policy for our nation's defence is no longer the Department of Defence's industry policy alone. It must be directed by government and designed and delivered by central departments, including Treasury and Finance, as well as the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. And this has to be done with the Department of Defence. And let's be clear, you can't develop a successful defence industry policy without talking with defence industry. We need to be a larger part of this conversation. The Australian military needs to access the growing number of new and powerful defence and dual-use systems developed by Australian companies or that can be onshored by Australian companies. Like the technologies we see in use by Ukraine, including Australian systems like the SIPAC drones and EOS and Defendtech's counter-drone weapons. But the many innovation grants and capability demonstrators will not grow the capability our Defence Force needs. Actual supply and production contracts of 4 years or longer between defence and Australian medium and small firms are needed. They build capacity, workforce, skills and incentivise new participants. The Australian military needs increased assured access to the key consumables of war. These include munitions and missiles. Stockpiling and local assembly of these supplies from foreign firms may be necessary, but that level of dependence on foreign supply is not a complete solution. The ADF needs access to assured flows of these supplies, not to tiny stockpiles that won't last long in a conflict and will be impossible to restock if our friends and allies are equally hard-pressed. This is key to our economic and national security and, frankly, our obligation to support the broader allied effort in maintaining peace. We need government to put a strong priority on defence, building direct, contractual, trusted partnerships with Australian medium and small firms, those companies that deliver complete systems and services. Defence must reshape its contractual and procurement policies and behaviours to enable this. The risk to reliable supply of our military in a time of crisis from relying on open competitions appealing to the global market are obvious. Instead, assured and resilient supply and rapid fielding of innovative capability should be the government's overriding priorities for defence industry. They should be the key criteria driving decisions on how the defence budget is spent. Nations like Israel and Sweden, both much smaller than Australia, have vibrant domestic defence industries that not only provide their own militaries with essential military capabilities, but provide their friends and allies, including Australia and the US, with systems we need. Detractors will point to unique challenges that exist for Australia right now as we contemplate how to match countries like Sweden and Israel that are decades ahead of us on the journey that we need to start. One such challenge is the ADF's recent switch to a requirement for much of their equipment to switch from interoperable with allies to interchangeable with allies. That often leads to a decision to simply buy American. Combining this requirement with the broader objectives of building domestic Australian production presents an opportunity for Australian companies to lead local industrialisation activities. This will allow us to build the necessary scale to not only produce interchangeable products locally, but to also develop uniquely Australian products, technologies and supply chains. To capture value for the nation, we must have Australian companies lead these initiatives. In parallel, we need more rapid evaluation of systems and solutions from medium and small firms, followed by equally rapid contracting if we are going to deliver what the ADF needs. Defence decision-making needs to operate to deliver real military capability at orders of magnitude faster than the current processes. It can take 4 and more years for contracts to be awarded, let alone for capability to actually be delivered. Defence must fully act on the direction of the Defence Strategic Review to adopt minimum viable capability. That means don't take years aiming for perfection when iterative development building on success and learning from failure is preferable and much more preferable than spending years seeking perfect technical solutions. Long time frames are only appropriate for high-end, exquisite systems like advanced fighters, submarines and major surface combatants. For almost all other systems provided by Australian companies, these long time frames should not apply. Defence's interaction with Australian medium and small firms must also recognise that cash flow is essential to business viability. Reasonable profits and a strong balance sheet enable these firms to deliver and develop more successful capabilities for our militaries. We are recommending today that a new budget provision should be within Defence's investment plan specifically to buy from projects run by Australian-owned firms. I mean companies headquartered and operating in Australia. These companies will have Australia as their core priority in times of crises. That's not true of firms headquartered and operating in the jurisdictions of even our most trusted partners who will be required to put those nations' needs first. Contracts should be directed to companies with a track record of successful delivery, and we need direct working relationships between military users of equipment and the Australian industry folk who design and deliver and supply that equipment. Middleware, that is the processes and bureaucracy, must be eliminated. In fact, we've seen this type of successful industry ADF collaboration in the past. The counter-IED, that is roadside bombs program that saved lives of Australian troops in Afghanistan, is actually an outstanding example. Australian-produced defence kit and services should be seen as complementary to what Defence buys from multinational defence primes, and Defence must end its search for refining ever more detailed strategic industry capability priorities, followed by detailed implementation plans that take years to develop and can't be enforced anyway. Further delays in action are likely to be the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of our struggling Australian defence companies. Much of defence industry planning in the past has lacked ambition and just acknowledged where the weight of defence spending in Australia naturally goes, notably on estate and sustainment activities. So let's do away with these centralised planning models that cannot keep up with the pace of strategic technological change, and I suggest that the real priority for Australian defence industry is simple: making the consumables of conflict, supplies and services essential in conflict. These consumables now include continuous supplies of what could be called the small, the smart and the many. Armed and unarmed drones and other disposable systems, guided missiles and munitions, traditional supplies such as fuel, food, medical supplies and services and deployable infrastructure, and the backbone of modern military operations such as data storage, analysis and communications. Shipbuilding also has to make this list because being able to build, repair, replace and sustain these vessels will be something that we must do should the worst happen and deterrence fail. We need to focus on products delivering practical capabilities to the military users. These will include a mix of uniquely Australian products designed and built by Australian companies and a robust onshoring effort of currently imported products to be produced in Australia by Australian companies. Ultimately, all of these products should form the base of export initiatives. That will give us the industrial scale and it will support our trusted allied partners. Above all, Defence must embrace an openness to solutions brought by medium and small Australian firms instead of setting prescriptive commercial and technology requirements based on a limited grasp of the technology that's actually available. Let me say that there is a lot that is good, tremendous even, in existing defence industry capability. It is not without reason that international primes come here and set up shop or partner with Australian companies to establish local capability. We have great people and technology. The Defence Force is going through a difficult time at present because of changes in technology and force planning. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it is a very capable organisation. Australian-owned and run industry offers a strong backbone to international primes wishing to operate in Australia, but it can also support the creation of our own Australian primes. That said, change has to come. With the statement that I'm releasing today on behalf of my partner companies, we are expressing a determination to help get these new industry policy settings right. Just like the foreshadowed National Defence Policy Statement, we think that a whole-of-government focus on defence industry policy is needed too. So let me offer to you the core recommendations of our report. I'll do that as simply and clearly as I can, pointing you to the greater detail in the study. First, we urge the government to commit to the idea of Australian-owned and run defence industry primes and setting the right policies which will see these Australian companies emerge. We must do this because of our deteriorating strategic outlook. We use the term prime to mean companies with the scale and sophistication to manage large and complex projects, noting that most of our Australian defence companies are medium or small enterprises. Let me be clear, that doesn't mean that international-owned primes aren't welcome, and it certainly doesn't mean that Defence will stop buying major equipment using the United States Foreign Military Sales Program. But we cannot maintain our current level of dependence on international partners at a time when these partners are facing their own supply crises. Australian-owned defence industry primes, leveraging Australian companies and trusted international supply chains, will make supplying the ADF their first priority, whatever the strategic circumstances. Australian defence industry primes will become more capable partners to our international primes, who are already an active and welcome part of the Australian defence landscape. If the Australian government agrees that having strong Australian defence primes is a necessary part of a strong, secure Australia, it needs to make it an explicit policy goal. The idea was in the background of previous industry policies, like the previous government's 2016 Defence Industry Policy Statement and its modern manufacturing initiatives, which had defence as one of 6 priority areas. But just hoping that strong Australian primes, capable of conducting large, complex defence projects, will emerge by themselves is not a strategy. Certainly they may emerge without an articulated policy, just as world-leading Australian defence manufacturers have exported without support from the government. But the chance of achieving this goal will be immeasurably strengthened with clear policy and measures that empower and provide resources. Second, we would like to see government establish an Australian Defence Industry Steering Council. Too much defence industry policy has been made in Australia for defence industry and not with defence industry. The best way to shape defence industry policy is to bring successful Australian industry players to the table, to collaborate and have industry work closely with military users in the ADF. The Steering Council must be drawn from leaders of companies with their headquarters in Australia and operations here, and be a combination of large, medium and small Australian firms. The Council must not become a large bureaucracy, but draw on the existing public service resources. Its key value is to bring Australian industry into a trusted and senior level policy discussion with government. Its key purpose will be to monitor the implementation of the Australian industry policy directions outlined in the report we are releasing today, and work in partnership with the government to deliver against its priorities. Of course, it can't have a role in deciding who gets what contracts, but it has a broader policy implementation role. Thirdly, we need a new definition of industrial sovereignty to drive government priorities. A recent Senate committee report said that there is a view among some within defence that built in Australia should be the acceptable threshold for being defined as sovereign to Australia. That is a risky assumption to make at a time when our friends and allies are facing immense pressures in their own defence industry systems. When a national crisis occurs, governments will demand absolute priority support from companies headquartered in their jurisdictions, and they will use legal and regulatory measures to achieve this. This is exercising sovereignty over industry. For Australia to assure its supplies in a conflict, we must have companies with headquarters and operations in Australia, where our defence needs will be the ultimate priority. Fourth, the Commonwealth procurement rules must change to recognise economic security and industrial sovereignty as value for money. The procurement rules need to explicitly support the need to build economic security with Australian industry capacity, that is, industrial sovereignty, so the ADF has assured access to what it needs in a sustained conflict. That is just as much a value for money criteria as cost. Recommendation number 5. Defence must change some core equipment procurement processes and grow direct partnerships with Australian companies. Assured and resilient supply and rapid fielding of innovative capability should be the government's overriding priorities for defence industry. They need to be the key criteria driving decisions on how the Australian defence budget is spent. In a strategic environment with zero expected warning time for credible conflict, some past behaviours and mindsets are now obsolete. Big change is urgently needed. Defence decision-making and business processes must now favour scale and mass. This has to be instead of the overriding focus at the moment on individual exquisite but unbelievably expensive platforms that dominate defence acquisitions. It must seek assured domestic supply of the consumables of conflict instead of relying on tiny stock holdings and potentially disrupted offshore supply chains. And rapid contracting, not based on cumbersome existing templates and procedures, is essential. Defence needs direct working partnerships with Australian companies and the actual military users of their products. Recommendation number 6, create a new $500 million budget line at the minimum in the May 2024 budget, growing to at least $1 billion a year to acquire capabilities and services from medium and small Australian companies for defence purposes. This must represent new acquisition spending, designed to assist investment in building the pathway to sovereign defence industrial capability. It must be new money separate from existing activities like the Australian Advanced Capabilities Accelerator, minor capital programs, sustainment and facilities work, and Australian subcontracting to the big foreign primes in major projects. The best defence industry policy will fail without funding. Cash flow and reasonable profit are enablers of successful product development and capability and service delivery. Grants and demonstrator funding do not deliver this and will not grow our industrial capability and our industrial sovereignty. Right now, I can tell you the perception in Australian defence industry is that little money is being directed to them from the Commonwealth. Major programs involving Australian companies are being cancelled, scaled back or in-housed to grow the public service. And governments have turned away from one of the key tenets of the First Principles Review, which was to have defence personnel do only what defence personnel needed to do and leave industry to do the rest. I look at many Australian defence companies and wonder if they will survive into 2024. We have job losses and businesses on life support. Plans for building factories and capabilities in Australia are on hold or have already shifted to other countries where they could. Why is this happening? Because so many reviews are stalling defence spending. Where is the sense of urgency of responding to the strategic crisis? Where is the strategic vision to build Australian defence companies? This new budget funding line should be immediately available from next year's budget, and it needs to grow over the next 3 years to a minimum of $1 billion annually. It is to enable medium and small firms to have certainty from their key government customer so they can invest, employ, develop and deliver capabilities to the ADF rapidly. The Albanese government has already committed to sourcing at least 20% of federal government procurement by value and 35% of contracts with a value up to $20 million from Australian SMEs. I welcome the Prime Minister's support for Australian industry, but where is the evidence that this policy is being delivered in defence procurement? Defence procurement represents one of the largest federal government expenditures. People deliver what is being measured and what they are accountable for. How is this being measured? And who is responsible for it in defence procurement? The US Defence Department features very strongly in the broader US government's equivalent small business set-aside program, which resulted in over US $160 billion spent this past year with American small businesses. This might be an exemplar program for Australian policymakers to study. Recommendation 7 is AUKUS Pillar 2 projects need to start delivering now by putting industry to work. Remember that Australia is intended to be a contributor to AUKUS, not just a price and technology taker. In fact, there is already awesome technology resident in Australian medium and small companies which need to be brought into the AUKUS conversation. The vision behind AUKUS is of 3 vibrant economies complementing each other and developing and supplying powerful capabilities to the Australian, US and UK militaries. This vision needs to have industry as a key player. We need to be involved in the discussions and the decisions with government and defence. We can't expect bureaucracies to to lead the development of highly disruptive technologies or even identify what those technologies are. In our three market-based economies, companies will not invest on hope. They need certain funding from the AUKUS governments, and given this, they will work to deliver against contracts. We want AUKUS Pillar 2 to deliver vibrant Australian, UK and US firms supplying and working across our national boundaries to the benefit of our three militaries and to the security of our region. Our eighth and final recommendation is this. It is time to abandon the fruitless search for the perfect list of strategic capability priorities that has long been a defence holy grail. Plans like the Strategic Industry Capability Priorities have not kept pace with the strategic and technological change. Instead, the priorities for Australian industry in the defence sector should be to deliver the supplies and services that are essential to ADF operations. I mentioned these earlier. These consumables include armed and unarmed drones, guided missiles and munitions, the traditional supplies such as fuel, food, medical material and deployable infrastructure, and the backbone of modern military operations such as services, data centres and communications, and our shipbuilding and maintenance capabilities. Many thanks for your attention. These are dangerous strategic times, but I assure you that Australian defence industry wants to play its part in making the ADF more ready, stronger and a more powerful deterrent force for peace and stability. This is a time for urgency, optimism and action. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert, for your speech there. Can I start? You obviously emphasised several times through the speech about the need to be producing consumables here in Australia. Do you have an assessment of how dire our stockpiles are? If we were to get involved in a major war tomorrow, how long would we be able to fight and sustain that effort for, given what we're seeing in situations like Ukraine, where the importance of that steady supply of munitions is critical to war efforts there?
Yeah. There's a lot of public commentary, a lot of statements on the public record about the state of our preparedness, and there are assessments that say Australia will last in a large-scale conflict with our consumables somewhere in the order of 1 week. Others may be a little more optimistic, but not too many. And in fairness, very large-scale conflict, even the US doesn't fare all that well when assessing their available stockpiles. And I think if you look at the conflict in Ukraine, whilst a devastating conflict for that nation, in the terms of what could be a large-scale conflict, that is actually a very small conflict. And the fact that whilst it's gone over a protracted period of time, it has depleted the stockpiles of available consumable munitions, largely of the Allied effort, is an outstanding or a stunning statement about our level of readiness. I don't think this is an Australian problem alone, but at the end of the day, we are here in Australia, so we can do something about solving our problems. And the other thing I would say is we won't fight alone, so these are complex issues. The things which Ukraine or Israel is finding difficult to get may not be the things that we need, but nonetheless, they will be consumable things which will be difficult to get. But we also, right now, have an obligation to be helping countries like Ukraine and the Allied effort to try and maintain peace. And just the fact that we don't have that scale for ourselves is bad enough, but the fact that we're unable to contribute as much as we could to an Allied effort, I think is also something we should be factoring into the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Cool. Our first question from the floor is Andrew Green.
Mr. Nioa, Andrew Green from the ABC. You did touch towards the end in your speech on AUKUS. I'm hoping you can expand on what you believe the effect of that strategic partnership, both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, have had on Australia's defence industry. The AUKUSisation, for want of a better word, of defence procurement is a lot of stuff just now coming FMS to the ADF. And also, given we've got the luxury of double-barrelled questions today, I think, your reaction to the proposed amendments to the Trade Control Act. Some critics have suggested that may be surrendering Australian sovereignty. I want to perhaps get your reaction to that criticism as well.
Okay, so on those two topics, I think largely, if we're talking today a little bit of a focus of Australian defence industrial base, I don't think you will find a lot of Australian companies that are saying they're getting something happening this year that's going to help them make their paycheck, their payroll at the end of this week or the end of the month out of AUKUS Pillar 1. And in saying that, that doesn't mean that that's not a really critically important outcome for the nation. I mean, we needed to do something about a submarine. So maybe not everything is going to translate to the topic of today, which is defence industrial base. In due course, I imagine there will be a very good, robust, strong benefit to the defence industrial base. But as defence industry, I think we see that as maybe some time off in the future. AUKUS Pillar 2, on the other hand, that is something which hasn't been as much of a focus. I sort of anticipate that next year our governments might grapple with what it means. It's still a little undefined, but you're going to be touching, I think, on areas that is going to get into more quantum computing, AI, maybe even technologies which support things in the hypersonic region, and a lot of smarter, smaller, more agile opportunities. And if you think about Australia's natural competitive advantage, we are very, very strong in that area. The academic base in Australia, our research institutions, our companies, we could actually take a lead in really bringing some of those technologies to bear. Now, that will need a concerted effort from government to actually carve out work as part of these tripartite negotiations of who gets what under AUKUS combined programs. So we need a government that's tuned into our capabilities and actually grabbing work and then having a program. It will need government investment. All of these things are going to need government to want to invest in an outcome. So I'd say that we're more hopeful. Once again, it's still work in the future, but it's a much nearer future than submarines, I think, for our industry. On the topic on the amendments to the Defence Export, what are they calling the Defence Trade Controls Bill? I've not read the absolute detail of that policy. I've been travelling this week since it was introduced. It's going for consultation. I am going to be actively involved in that. There's the place where I start with that, though, because I've done some reading on it, is if this means that ITAR's controlled technology born in the US that comes to Australia can be shared more easily with Australian companies and to our UK partners if we are trying to work on joint programs. If that's the end result of it, then that will be a positive. If a potential negative outcome, however, is if we generate uniquely Australian intellectual property within our own boundaries or own borders, and if whatever the regime is applied to it restricts us from working with our Indo-Pacific partners, where we need to, as a nation, demonstrate that we are sharing technologies and that we are a very good friend in the Indo-Pacific, or that it simply hampers Australian companies from recruiting workforce or doing things, then that would be a bad outcome. And what I don't know, because the consultation, as I understand it, is still active, is how open the government is to ensure that it appeases both sides. And I know that there's going to be lots of people really piling in on that topic who are probably a lot smarter than me on those issues. So, but that would be my warnings, that it could be good, but there is a real potential that it could, if not applied correctly, provide some perverse sort of unintended consequences.
Our next question is from Ben Packham.
Thank you. Ben Packham from The Australian. 27 years after Port Arthur, Australia does not have a national firearms register. Do you support the creation of such a register, and how do you think it should be funded? And if I may, you mentioned a lack of consultation with defence industry on strategies. I'd like to ask about the delayed defence industry development strategy. How was the consultation on that, and what are you hoping for from that strategy?
Righto, thanks Ben. Nice broad-ranging set of questions. The first thing is, yes, we do support the formation of a... it's been named different things over the last decade particularly, but in its essence what's currently being referred to as a National Firearms Registry. That's been supported by industry now for more than a decade, and we've called on successive governments to do that. And the only thing that's stopping that happening is actually the allocation of federal government money. That's been the problem, not just for this government, but successive governments. It's been announced on multiple occasions and it's never been done. And there's no objection from state jurisdictions, there's no objections from industry, there's no objections from users. I'm not sure why we can find hundreds of millions of dollars for lots of things, but why that would be a challenge. This is simply an IT program. We do have registers in every single state. We do transfer the information to every single state. We're not talking about reinventing anything. It's just about making sure that it's shared, data's shared in real time, and that there's integrity of the data. So data's been lost, and as a result of that, community safety has degraded, and it's been going on now for a long time. So I don't know. I talk to heads of weapons registries. They're not sure why government isn't acting, and nor are we. Your second question was...
Defence industry development strategy. What was the consultation like on that?
Yeah. Look, I think there's been two things complicating our engagement. Government has not wanted, maybe for very good reasons, to have an open conversation around the extent of defence industry preparation that we need to do as a nation. They've been grappling with how much of this conversation needs to be kept internal and how much external. And the topics that we've put on the table today paint a picture which is a very difficult conversation in a national narrative. It's easier to have enclosed, controlled discussions, people with security clearances and briefings. But the actual Defence Strategic Review called on the government to open this up and engage with the nation about this discussion that we do need to prepare. And I say that as a background because I think Defence did what they could do by way of industry engagement in trying to develop policy, but I would say it's not the engagement we need going forward. And I think we're probably at a point of time where there needs to be a reset in the objectives of what we're trying to achieve. We've been trying to conduct reviews on a sort of a scene that's been set for the last 5 years, as opposed to what's the dialogue looking for the scene 5 years ahead. And so I'm not critical of anything that we've had up to this point, but I think we've had enough time now to digest the recommendations of the DSR. We should have had time to digest the messages, and we know that the situation's getting worse. And so we now need to move into a different stage of dialogue.
Thank you.
Do you think Labor philosophically understands defence industry? The impression I always get is when they talk about defence industry jobs, they talk about unionised jobs at, you know, big employers, your big primes like a BAE shipyard or something like that. And they don't think of it so much in terms of small business, people in the back blocks of regional towns or things like that, producing maybe only 10, 20 workers producing a widget that goes into the ship or something like that. Is that something that you feel like you come across? Is there a philosophical sort of tension there between?
I think right now there is, I've not seen a tender where there's a preference for an Australian outcome, an Australian company. So I would say from a policy setting, we are simply looking at products at the moment. I think that's, and government is not actively driving a change in that procurement strategy. I don't know that that's a Labor, I don't know, I wouldn't know enough to say that that's their strategy or policy. I think that's a bit of a legacy, actually, of the last 20 years of peace dividend, where almost all of our procurement has really been shaped by, we've got limited budgets, what's the cost? It costs more to invest in industry up front, even though you get a better national dividend in the long term. People haven't been trying to build a national defence industrial base properly, in my view. We've had some attempts, but the strategic environment is different. So I'm not sure, I wouldn't hang it on a Labor policy as such, but it is lacking in current policy for sure. We're hopeful with the report we've released today, which outlines, I think, a very polite dialogue around a range of topics and provides positive options for government to embrace, that if government does want to move to the new strategic settings, that I think we've given them from industry a really detailed document and formula that they could follow to engage in that policy reset. So I'm hopeful that we can contribute to what happens maybe in 2024.
Next question, Nick Stewart.
Your speech actually began quite like Minister Conroy's earlier this week on the same podium. You both said, we are facing dangerous times, and there was a real focus on the current danger. After that, he started talking about 2040 and the delivery of an AUKUS submarine. What you're talking about seems to be quite substantially, qualitatively different, because you're talking about smart, small, agile, locally made, new ways of thinking about weapons of war, rather than just the grand nuclear submarine that will somehow or another provide safety and security. You're talking about new methods of doing that don't rely on one particular item of equipment. Is that what you're talking about, rather than sending a couple of $1 billion over to the US, as we are now doing, we should be investing it immediately in Australian industry to provide these sort of smart, agile missiles that you're talking about?
Absolutely. So the consumables of war more broadly, but absolutely. So there's a couple of aspects to what you've talked about there, and I think we're seeing play out in Ukraine. You know, they're losing 10,000 drones a month, right? If we are involved in a conflict, are we going to get deliveries of 10,000 drones a month at a time where there's global conflict? So as we talk about what we know now, this is not a guess, we're not having to guess, we know what the consumables of conflict will look like, and they are well within the capabilities of Australian companies to develop now. I've used that as one example. The categories I talked about before are very, very broad. So we need to allocate billions of dollars immediately to those consumables, not billions of dollars. To be honest, we need to do both, right? We need extra money, okay? So we don't want to turn off big platforms because we're going to need them, but we need to do this as well. The other thing which has been missing from the discussion, which I'd like to point out, is we are starting from a very, very low base in some areas of our industrial base. Others, we've got a bit more maturity. But invariably what we're going to need to do is build new factories, all right? So it's not just going to be, we've got an existing production line with existing intellectual property and a well-exercised workforce that we just need to incrementally expand. We're going to have to build new factories. So if 6 years from now we need increased consumables of war, we are at 0 day today. If we needed it in 3 years, we are 3 years late. So when we talk about the urgency and the priorities, I do think there's been perhaps missing in the debate is people understanding what an industrialisation activity looks like. And if I just quickly take you generically through, if you need a new factory, it doesn't matter what, if it's a high-tech munitions-y or defence-related factory that isn't here, you're going to start with a year of designing, planning, locating, engaging, construction companies and doing all of that. You're then going to build really quickly in 2 years. You're going to build the physical infrastructure, and at that time, you're going to order the equipment that goes in it that we don't make in Australia. So you're going to be competing in the world market for really complex equipment that's made somewhere else and hoping you're in front of the line. Then that's going to come. At the end of that, we're now at 3 years. Then you're going to spend a year, maybe 2 years, in the installation and then the final commissioning. And then you're going to get into first article testing, low rate production. And before that is turning out high volumes of product, when we're talking about complex precision munitions or things of that nature, that's a 6-year journey. And so those alarm bells that we're talking about need to be rung urgently. And so I think that it's a pretty complex space. It's not, don't go and spend the money on stuff in 2040 and don't do this. And some things are going to take longer than others, but we need to start next year. I'd like to have started 3 years ago, but we did. We built a factory, I suppose, or two. But I think, next year's as good a year as any to start.
Thanks. The other thing is you talked about AUKUS there, and it's not impossible that in 18 months' time, the 3 people who signed that submarine agreement might have all been deposed. Obviously, Joe Biden is currently in the polls, not doing well in the US. Rishi Sunak appears to be on his way out. And there's even a chance that Peter Dutton, the opposition leader who's here today, may actually become Prime Minister. Would we be in a situation where if we really double down on AUKUS, that we risk being subsumed in some sort, just being left behind by the US, which has its own quite understandable needs to support its own industry? Do we need to actually rather say, look, we've got an Australian industry policy first, we're going to go ahead with that, and we will try and fit in with AUKUS where we can. So make Australia the first point of call.
Make Australia great again, is that what we're saying? Look, there's a couple of different elements to that. The first thing is I don't know what's going to happen with the leadership, obviously, but I think that there's enough support between UK, Australia, US that I don't think it matters. I don't think leadership will change the intent and the delivery of AUKUS, would be my view.
So the deep state will win?
The what, sorry?
The deep state will win?
I don't know. Well, it always wins. So I don't think that's going to change. What I would say, though, is regardless of AUKUS, we have to pull our weight. Americans don't run a charity. And if we have the opportunity to be lifting our game and doing something and investing, and we don't, then it's unreasonable for us to demand of the Americans to put us ahead of the queue of other countries that are in a conflict or that need their help more than us. And so we have to be respectful of the world community and actually do our part. And then agreements are agreements, but this comes down to relationship management, and you need to demonstrate that you are respecting the agreement and that you are a contributor. And so I think looking for early wins next year, maybe around AUKUS Pillar 2, whereas we might not be able to lead Pillar 1, but Pillar 2, that might be an opportunity for us to really get out of the blocks hard and really bring to the trilateral arrangement some unique technologies and demonstrate our value. And I think if we do that, then we'll be respected in that partnership. So that's up to us from a leadership position. If we choose to do nothing, then I think, we'll get treated. The risk of the things you talked about could very well eventuate, but we have to relationship manage that, would be my view.
Next question from Kim Bergman.
Thanks, Rob. Kim Bergman from Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. Following on from Nick's question, as a consequence of AUKUS, Australia is getting ready to hand over $4.7 billion to the US for the US government to spend on their industry with no further input from Australia. Can I have your thoughts on the logic of that, and what would be the consequences in a practical way of that amount of money being spent in Australia with Australian companies?
Yeah. Thanks, Kim. Appreciate the question. So the first thing is I really don't understand the contracting arrangement that Australia has, but what I can say is $4.7 billion of expenditure allocated to Australian companies for our consumables of war would change the landscape and the national security position of our nation overnight. It would be an absolute game changer. And 4.7 billion allocated to Australian industry is not the total quantum you can get from that. You can leverage that through that level of investment allows you to go and find public-private partnerships, go and look at innovative additional funding models, support adjacent industries. The 4.7, the multiplier effect on that can be much bigger than 4.7 billion sent overseas. That said, I don't doubt that we owe the Americans 4.7, so we better pay our bills. If it's due now, we better pay it, because we are certainly reliant on them and we want to be good international partners. I think as we talk around any of these issues, there is competing issues, both within the defence realm, but even we're talking more broadly. If we talk about industrial or sovereign resilience, medical, fuel, all of these other things which go about making the nation more resilient. So we've got competing requirements on the federal budget for all sorts of things. I think defence at this point in time should have a much higher priority than it has, and I don't think that we can afford not to do the things we're doing, but we have to have more money for defence earlier, not the same amount of money later for defence.
I'll just clarify, but as far as I'm aware, it's not money that we owe, it's money that we're voluntarily handing over. They haven't even asked for it, is my understanding. We've said, here, please have this bucket of money as our thank you for being nice to us.
Well, if that's the case, I think you could survey the room of industry participants here and we would volunteer as well to receive that. No, but I think, I really don't know what their arrangements are, but we really need money spent now with Australian companies building local capability, and that type of money would be a massive change to our industrial landscape. But at the end of the day, remember that the defence industrial base is about supporting the men and women of the ADF. So it would be a massive change for them. We can't send men and women into harm's way without adequate continuous supply of consumables, right? Now, the consumables we talk of in this report are not just defence, they're actually our whole of nation consumables. So we also have to make sure that the general public has their consumables as well. But to actually conduct armed conflict, we need to make sure we are providing the tools to the men and women we put in harm's way. So, anything you can do to change that, cancel that cheque, redirect it to Australia, we'd be very, very happy to receive it. I think the men and women of the ADF would be happy as well.
Can I go to the report and recommendation 1, establishing Australian defence industry primes? Do you have any thoughts on what sort of ownership sort of structure that should look like, or how that should coalesce? We've seen, for instance, just down the road, the government spend $500 million to nationalise CEA radars. We saw last week Pat Conroy announced in Perth that Austal would become the strategic shipbuilder, effectively handed a 10-year monopoly on shipbuilding work in Perth. At the same time, while that's going on, we're reading about Austal sort of being stalked by American private equity firms. So there's a very real risk that this company could end in private hands, and particularly given in America where so much of their business is now. You've got, obviously, your company's a family-owned business. What's the ideal sort of structure for growing these primes?
It's a vexing issue, and you've also got to look at a combination of publicly owned companies compared to privately owned companies, and then the various structures that exist there. Because if you've got a publicly traded company, even if it's headquartered in Australia and listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, then perhaps you run into issues around maybe takeovers from hostile takeovers from companies or countries that you don't like. So I think that there's a combination of, if we go back to if we take it to the higher level principle, companies headquartered here, where the Australian government can exercise sovereign control, should be the objective, and that is probably able to be achieved under 2 or 3 different models and scenarios. We operate 4 companies in different, some 100% Australian family owned, others in joint venture with Rheinmetall, international partner, and then our discussions with L3 Aerojet are exploring opportunities about another structure. At the end of the day, the Australian government needs to be able to exercise sovereign control of those companies, and the more that you can do that, and the earlier you can do that, the better outcome for the nation. So, for example, people say, well, if a factory exists, we can just go and take it over, and when we need it. Now, if that was the case, that may be the case, but if it doesn't make what you need, and you haven't engaged, if it hasn't developed an export strategy and it hasn't developed scale, and it's not building the size of the quantum of the things you need, and the company that's running that is not naturally answerable to the Australian government to develop that long-term strategy, then that will be a challenge. Right? Now, that said, there are very good international companies operating in Australia that have been able to come to contractual arrangements with the Commonwealth to allow them to exercise near equivalent, of sovereign control. But it's almost a case-by-case basis. The perfect scenario is an Australian company answerable just to the Australian government and focused on the objectives of the Australian nation.
So it sounds like more a contracting thing rather than equity, perhaps.
So you revert to contract if you don't have the optimal structure. So they're the tiers. You will fall back from one. It will be obviously sovereign and all yours. If you can't achieve that, then you try and achieve the same thing through contractual mechanisms. There is a lot to the shared, trying to align the objectives of a company with the objectives of a nation. America is very good at that. American companies sell to the outside world to build scale so that America has capacity in time of conflict. Okay, and so they are all of the, and the American government helps those companies export, and that is building a national, national resilience and a national capability, which is super impressive. But it's theirs, and they can exercise control the minute they want. The supply chain, the IP, and the output. And so I think that there's various ways nations around the world try and go at this, but Australia has to grapple with this.
All right, we've just got 2 questions to go, so we'll go back to Andrew Green and then Ben afterwards.
Rob, I'll take you now to the Australian Missile Corporation, and conscious that the Air Marshal's just near me at the moment. Can you give us an update on what missiles are actually being worked on at the moment, and what taxpayers are getting for the contributions going there?
First thing, so Leon Phillips, the Air Marshal in charge of GUIO program, is here, and thank you very much, Leon, for your attendance. I'd have to say it's been Leon coming to the job and standing up the new GUIO group has been one of the bright green shoots on the defence industry landscape. That only took shape after the DSR in March. In June, the organisation was stood up, and we're sitting here in November. I am aware that there's a lot of work going on more broadly around preparing for cabinet submissions for activity. The Australian Missile Corporation was established by us as a collaboration platform. It then got a contract with the Australian Department of Defence to provide advice to the government, and we have separated that company physically from our control. So that is run by Lee Goddard, who's the CEO, who reports in on his contract to Leon. So I'm not privy to the work that Leon and Lee are doing more broadly, but from the Nioa side of things, where we're operational at Benalla and other things, and we're working with Aerojet on rocket motors and other things where we're directly trying to propose putting forward solutions, we've found an open door for presenting options and ideas to the GWIO group, and we've found them to be very engaging. I would say that they are interested in the consumables of conflict. I'd say that they are limited in bandwidth about how deep and how much money and all of the complexities, but I think they are getting after some of the more immediate priorities. Personally, I think rocket motors and warheads is something which is what we would call a horizontal capability. It goes across any number of different types of products. And that would, if we could get that national infrastructure established, however it's established, it would allow companies, Kongsberg, BAE, Lockheed, Raytheon, lots of other companies to benefit, and it would also be infrastructure available for Australian companies to actually start R&D and activity. So I think that we're probably heading in the right path on that front. We have, if we want to get actual missiles produced in Australia, we are going to have to work very closely with our American partners, and then we need to also address their supply chain issues and vulnerabilities. So I think we're working pretty well, hand in glove, with the US partners, the US companies, and so I'm hopeful that after the Cabinet submission, I think it's sometime early next year, the DSR talked about providing a timeline, maybe by middle of next year, we should be at some decision-making points in time for that.
Great, cool. And our last question from Ben Packham again.
Thank you again. I'd also like to ask a question on GWIO. The government says that Australia will be building guided missiles by 2025, which seems like an extraordinarily short time frame given everything we know about defence procurement and the track record so far. Do you think that's a realistic time frame? What do you think we might be able to produce by then? And where are things at on the production of Australian rocket fuel?
Ammonium perchlorate.
Yeah, exactly, which I believe Nioa is interested in.
Yep.
Doing.
Well, the first thing is I'm just standing back and having a look at those statements, and I think I've been at some speeches where Minister Conroy's been there and he's explained the aspirations for the 2025 outlook. It's an entirely logical place to start, and that is to establish assembly capability in Australia, and that in itself is not an uncomplicated exercise. Firstly, we've got lots of intellectual property transfer. We've got to exercise all sorts of agreements with the US government. We've got to get government-to-government buy-in. We've then got to get physical facilities built. We've got to get security plans in place. We've got to get physical test jigs and all sorts of things. And then having done all of that and certified that and built the workforce, you then have to physically do first article tests, and then all sorts of test firing. We need range equipment. We need that in itself by 2025. Is a pretty impressive goal. However, in parallel, right, we should start immediately on then saying we need to substitute the major subsystems which are being imported. Those start in priority order. If there's no bottleneck right at this point for a certain thing, then you might put that on a low priority. But if we have a shared issue, say with the US, and we can jointly say we want to get at that subsystem, then we should invest, lean forward, help our ally, lean forward, help ourselves, and actually create that industrial base ready. So by the time you've finished your assembly, you're 2 years, maybe 2 and a bit years into the actual production of a facility to take a subsystem to bring it into production, and then the next year you're actually trying to introduce that and qualify a component by component. And then also that allows you to get your Australian SMEs, your medium and small companies, actually going and surveying them, tasking them, seeing what technologies they've got, looking at maybe giving them work on, all sorts of complicated things. So I think there's a public statement. I think the next level of work I'd love to see is that parallel activity, which I'd like government to move out on. And they may very well be planning to do that. I'm not privy to their plans. I mean, that may be, the big May 24 budget announcements, and they're going to hold off till then and keep you guys all excited in a budget press conference. And then there was something else.
The fuel.
The fuel. So, solid rocket motors, there's sort of three elements to them. One of them is ammonium perchlorate, which we don't, there's pretty limited sources around the world. The rest of it's aluminium powder and some rubber binding things. There is options for Australian industry to make ammonium perchlorate. There's multiple options. And I think that would be a really good, interesting place to contribute to the Allied effort, because I think that's going to be something that's in short supply. So once again, Australia is a smaller player, finding the little niches where we make a really high value difference to the Allied effort. That's pretty important. And if we establish a critical capability, not suggesting we would trade off with our Allied partners too much, but it does give you a bit of a lever if you've got something they need and they've got something we need. So it would be good if we found those things. I think that would be one of the things we should be going after.
Thank you.
Robert and I thank you very much for a high calibre discussion and speech today.
Thank you.
Please, everyone. Yeah, we've got there. Thank you very much for your time. Everyone, please thank Robert for his effort.